Here we go. Awesome. Okay, great. Got it figured out. All right, hopefully everyone is here to learn about the appeals process for gender-affirming care in Kentucky. I'm gonna try to move fast on my little intro here since we had some technical difficulties. I'm Oliver. I'm the Trans Health Director for Kentucky Health Justice Network. I use they, them pronouns. Our program works to help trans Kentuckians access the healthcare they need, as well as reaffirm our autonomy and community. We do this through advocacy, support, financial assistance for gender-affirming care and items, emergency housing, connecting folks with online and community resources, and assistance navigating insurance, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. Here's an overview of some of the things we are going to be covering. I would ask, just because I cannot view the chat and have this presentation window up at the same time, that if you have questions, you try to save them to the end unless they're like super pressing. You can be like me and have a pen and paper and write them down as you think about them so you can have them toward the end. But we're going to be talking about the 4 most important things to keep in mind when you're going through the appeals process: legal protections for gender-affirming care, types of denials, types of appeals, provider letters, the appeals process steps, civil rights complaints, and some next steps that you all can take to support new civil rights protections for trans folks accessing healthcare. Just wanted to make a note that we're not going to be going into detail about the Medicare appeals process today because it is a 5-part process and it is its whole own presentation. But if that's something that people are interested in, definitely shoot me an email, and if enough folks are interested, we can do a workshop on that as well. So 4 things to keep in mind. First off, expect a fight. Almost everyone gets an initial denial. The insurance company's goal is to make money, and so they will do anything they can to deny care. It's important not to get discouraged. It's super common to get that first denial, but yeah. Most important guideline for me is to get everything in writing. To work with a lawyer, if you need one down the line, you're going to want to have a paper trail of your communication with your insurance company. So also with that, take anything that's only said on the phone with a grain of salt, namely because you'll have no proof of what was said to you. So, even if someone, if you call your insurance company and someone tells you, hey, yeah, your surgery's totally gonna be covered, no problem. That doesn't necessarily mean your surgery is going to be covered, and you're not going to have evidence that you've had that conversation. And also, you once again want to take what you hear on the phone with a grain of salt, because call center employees for insurance companies generally don't receive adequate training, especially with regards to gender-affirming care, and they may be unable to give you correct or binding information. Number 3, start as early as possible. Start working very early with your provider on trying to get pre-authorization. The process can take a long time, and if you wait until close to your surgery date to start the process, you are likely to end up having to delay care or pay out of pocket. And last but not least, ask for help. The process is intentionally convoluted, as you will see throughout this presentation, and it is meant to discourage people from trying to get care. There's no shame in asking for help. I like that I have the workshop there because I did this before, but you're at the workshop. There's no shame in reaching out for help. You can always reach out to us, transhealth@khjn.org, and if it's something we are unable to help you with, we will try to connect you to one of the larger trans-focused legal entities like TILDEF or the Trans Law Center. Here are some of the laws and statutes that give us protections for gender-affirming care. Most notably for us today is Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. There are also some protections in the Americans with Disabilities Act. There was a recent court case that kind of solidified those protections for trans folks specifically, not just trans folks with disabilities. We're not going to be going into detail with that today because, once again, so much to cover. But if that is an interest for folks, definitely shoot us an email and we can do something for that. There's also the Medicaid Act, which has some protection, some civil rights protections. There's Title VII for employer-based plans. There's Title IX for education-based plans. And there are some state insurance laws and bulletins, mainly in other states. We're talking about civil rights complaints or civil rights protections. We don't really have civil rights protections for healthcare in Kentucky in our state law, insurance law and bulletin. Actually, we have quite the opposite, unfortunately. These are mainly going to be useful for you in filing civil rights complaints with Health and Human Services, which we're going to talk about later, or if you end up pursuing a legal challenge. So once again, the one that I wanted to go over, which is the most important for us tonight, is Section 1557 of the ACA. This was kind of landmark for trans folks, and especially the rules that have come since the ACA was passed from Health and Human Services, explicitly saying that this section applies to trans folks, have been super helpful. We're also going to circle back to this later because they are currently taking comments on a proposed rule that would kind of further these protections for trans folks accessing healthcare. But basically what it says is that individuals can't be denied healthcare or coverage based on their sex, which they read to include gender identity. Individuals must be treated consistently with their gender identity, including in access to facilities. Sex-specific healthcare cannot be denied or limited just because of a person's gender. So for instance, if a trans man needed a cervical exam, an insurance company could not deny care because of his identity as a man, because the treatment is still medically necessary. It also explicitly says that explicit categorical exclusions in coverage for all transition-related care are facially discriminatory. So, and where they're making that distinction on the next line, an example of that for what might be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, if your insurance company had a policy that said they consider facial feminization and facial masculinization to be cosmetic, that's an exclusion that would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But if your insurance company had in its plan policy, like, we don't cover any transition-related care, or as they often say, like, we don't cover any sex transformation services, that's what's called a categorical exclusion, which is facially discriminatory, and you would definitely want to file a civil rights complaint. Some documents you might want to gather, two main documents for going through the appeals process. The first one is your plan policy. So that's where you're going to find out if there is a blanket exclusion. They make it confusing because it's not always called the same thing depending on what your insurance company is. I made a list of some of the things that might be called: certificate of coverage, member handbook, certificate of insurance, things like that. But the key here to remember is that it's not the shorter document, which is usually called a summary of benefits, which is usually like 6 or 7 pages. It's going to be a really long document. It's like 70+ pages that will include every possible medical care that you could access under your insurance company. That's what you're going to want to find if there is a plan exclusion. You can often find this on your insurance company's website if they have a member portal like I do with United Healthcare. I know Humana also has one. But if there's not a member portal, you may have to call, but you can just call and request that, and they will either email it to you or mail it to your home address. The second document that will be helpful to have is the clinical criteria. This is what's going to tell you what is necessary to meet a medical necessity requirement for your insurance company. Sometimes you are able to Google this, like I might be able to Google, United Healthcare of Kentucky treatment for gender dysphoria, and find what their requirements are. That's where you're going to find requirements like, do I need a therapist letter? Do I need to be on HRT? Things like that. You might also have to call and request that. I will say for both of these, if you have an employer-based plan, you can get these from your HR department. And especially if you have an HR person who is relatively knowledgeable, I would lean on them for this to do some of this labor, especially if they are cis and they can kind of make some of these calls for you and gather this information for you. All right, into the meat of it. Here are the 3 main types of denials that you might get for gender-affirming care. The first one is a blanket exclusion. Once again, that's something found in the plan policy. I have an example of that on the next page, but what's important to consider there is that legal action will end up being needed to overturn the denial, and that care will be denied even if it's medically necessary. So even if you meet whatever the medical necessity requirements are, if there is a blanket exclusion on transition-related care in your plan policy, they are going to deny you anyway, and you will have to take legal action. The second type of denial, which is mainly what we're going to be talking about tonight, because this is where you're going to have the most luck of overcoming a denial through the appeals process, is a medical necessity denial. So that's going to be based on the clinical criteria, and this is not binding and can be overcome through the appeals process by demonstrating medical necessity. Once again, so many of the following is going to apply to medical necessity denials. That's basically going to be where you're going to have the best luck of an appeal. The third type of denial you might get is for sex-specific care. If you get a denial for something considered sex-specific care, like a gynecological exam, treatment for cervical cancer, prostate exam, things like that, fret not. Usually those are very easy to overcome because these are computer-generated denials, just based on, whatever the procedure code is and your sex within your insurance company. So insurance companies are not, they're not in the modern age, and their computers don't know about trans people. So if you are someone who needs a prostate exam and you have a female gender marker with your insurance company, that might result in an automatic just procedural denial. But things like this can often be really easily overcome just by calling your insurance company or having your provider call your insurance company and be like, hey, this person needs this care. They still have a prostate. Cover this. If not, obviously that's not a time you would go through the appeals process, but generally those things are pretty easy to get covered. Like I mentioned, I just wanted to give a kind of an example of what a blanket exclusion would look like in a plan policy. This is actually, one from a different state, but here you see like sex transformation operation and related services, including reversal of a sex transformation operation. So once again, this is from another state, but unfortunately, a lot of the policies within the state of Kentucky contain kind of similar language, but that's the language you're going to be looking for. So if you end up getting a PDF of your plan policy, you might have to, if it's long and you don't want to scroll through it all, you might have to search some kind of shitty things to find if there's a blanket exclusion. So you might want to search like sex transformation, sex change services, things like that. And if you're having trouble finding that in your plan policy, once again, you can email us, transhealth@khjn.org, and we can help you search for that. So types of appeals. For all of these, except peer-to-peer appeal, just be aware of deadlines. You can usually find those on your insurance company's website, or they should provide that information to you in your initial denial letter. Not all of these are going to apply to your appeals process, depending on if you have, Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance that's governed by state law, private insurance that's not governed by state law. But I just wanted to make sure we kind of had the same knowledge about terminology here. So a peer-to-peer appeal is an appeal that a provider makes to your insurance company on your behalf. It is not a formal part of the appeals process, but it can be effective, especially if you were talking about something like HRT. For instance, my doctor did a peer-to-peer appeal because I do testosterone gel, because the dosage that I wanted was not achievable through shots. So I got an initial denial from my insurance company. They said, hey, we don't cover, transdermal applications. My doctor was able to call and say, this is why for this patient, this is absolutely necessary. They cannot do shots. And then I got it approved and was able to get that care covered. The next type is going to be applicable for pretty much every appeals process, is the internal appeal. So that goes to your insurance company. You're appealing back to the doctor that works for your insurance company, and they will review the appeal again. This can be done by you or by your provider on your behalf. Next type is an external appeal. So the external appeal is going to what is called an IRE, an independent review entity. And then the last type is a fair trial hearing. This is only relevant for Medicaid. If you have private insurance, you will not have a fair trial hearing. And a fair trial hearing is an appeal to the state. So, basic process. These, once again, as a note, these are for the patient appeals process. There is a provider's appeal process, which is a bit different. If you have questions about the provider appeals process, please email us. If there are enough people who are interested, enough providers who are interested in doing appeals on behalf of their patients, then we can definitely have a workshop about the provider's appeals process, because it is just a little bit different. For Medicaid, for private insurance, unfortunately is insanely complicated for no reason. But if you have a private insurance, if you have private insurance or an employer plan that is subject to state insurance law, the first stage is going to be the internal appeal to your insurance company, and then the second and last stage is going to be an external appeal. The reason I say subject to state insurance law, and this would be a great time if I had my notes, because I had notes here on this, but there is something called the Employer Retirement Insurance or Employer Insurance Retirement Security Act, which governs some larger plans which operate in multiple, or governs larger plans for employers that operate in multiple states. And the intention there is so that they don't have to follow state insurance law, so that they can have the same policy from state to state. But the way to find out if your employer plan is governed by that law is, once again, just to ask your HR person. They should be able to very easily find that information for you. And then once they find that information, they can give you clarity on the appeals process for your specific plan. Some of these plans the appeals process will look just like the regular private insurance plans. Some might only have one stage. They might only have the internal appeal. And if they only have the internal appeal, then the next and last stage for your appeals process is going to be an appeal to federal court, because that is a federal law governing those plans. If you have Medicaid, it's also a two-part appeals process. You have the internal appeal, and then you have a fair trial hearing, both of which we're going to talk about more in a second. Medicare, once again, we're not going to be going over in detail all of the Medicare appeals process, because it would take the whole hour plus some. And so while the basic 5 levels are the same, the guidance is also different if you have original Medicare versus a Medicare health plan. So if you're going through the Medicare appeals process and need assistance, please email us. Once again, the email is up there. But I did want to go ahead and just list those 5 levels. So the first level is the redetermination by the Medicare administrative contractor. That's going to be very similar to the internal appeals process that we talk about. Level 2 is the reconsideration by a qualified independent contractor. If the qualified independent contractor sounds similar to independent review entity, it's because it is. That will be very similar to the external appeals process. Level 3 through 5 is where it gets a little different. You'll get a decision by the Office of Medicare Hearings and Appeals, and then a review by the Medicare Appeals Council. And then the last stage for appeal, if you have Medicare, is a judicial review by a federal district court. Internal appeals. So this applies both to private insurance and Medicaid. Number one thing here, be aware of deadlines. Usually the deadline for filing an internal appeal is 30 days after you receive the initial denial. Basically, what you want to include is a letter explaining why you believe their decision was wrong, an authorization to appeal if you're having someone else appeal for you, like a friend, family member, a lawyer. They will provide the information for where to get an authorization to appeal in your initial denial letter. They should provide all of this information for you on the appeals process. You'll also want to include medical necessity literature, which can include things like WPATH standards of care and the American Medical Association medical necessity statement on gender affirming care. Once again, this would be a great note for me to have had my notes up, because we just got new WPATH standards of care. So we're going to be seeing some changes with insurance companies who follow the WPATH standards of care, and for providers who follow the WPATH standards of care. Because in this new 8th edition of the standards of care, they have affirmed that facial feminization and facial masculinization are medically necessary treatments, whereas they had not before. And so hopefully we're going to be seeing more insurance companies actually covering those things if they continue to follow WPATH standards of care. The new WPATH standards of care also remove the explicit requirement for psychotherapy before surgery. So hopefully we will see insurance companies and providers removing that requirement. They still suggest it. They say it's probably very helpful for trans people to have therapy before surgery, but having that as an explicit requirement actually harms the mental health of trans people who might, have more luck in therapy after they, get that initial need for gender affirming care taken care of. You'll also want to include letters from your providers, revised if you already had them in your prior authorization request. And if you're revising them, you just want to kind of look at the letter, have your provider look at the letter, make sure it's as strong as possible. And we're going to talk on the next slide about what a strong provider letter looks like. So what to include? If you are a provider or you're, asking these things of your provider, you want to make sure that they are including their qualifications and experience. So is this a therapist who has been treating trans people for 10 years? That's something that they want to state. Is this a physician who has gone through, the Fenway Institute's, specific training for treating trans patients? What specific qualifications do they have? What makes them an expert in treating gender dysphoria? You also want them to address specifically your insurance company's medical necessity criteria. So if your insurance company has a requirement like 12 months of HRT, this is where you would want your provider to say, my patient has been on HRT for 3 years. And you kind of just want them to go line by line. Their mental health condition is stable. Unfortunately, usually is a requirement listed by insurance companies. So you just want to make sure that they list each of those things. And with that, explain if there are exceptions. Like, is there a reason that this patient can't be on HRT, like a medical or mental health reason where HRT is not the right decision for this patient? You'll want to have your provider, or if you are a provider, you'll want to just explain why that is an exception there. Most importantly, you want to include the words medically necessary. This is a medically necessary treatment for this patient and will alleviate their gender dysphoria. Overall, you just want this letter to tell a story of why this care is medically necessary for you. If your provider needs guidance or wants a form, or your provider who wants guidance or wants to kind of talk through what these letters can look like, definitely have them email us. This is something we've helped providers with in the past, and I am more than happy to chat with providers who are willing to provide the service, because it is still unfortunately necessary for a lot of folks to access care. External appeals. So this applies to private insurance mainly. Once again, be aware of deadlines. I don't have that listed there because I have seen different things about what these deadlines are, but usually it's about 60 days after you get your internal appeal denial. And these go to what is called an independent review entity. So this is not going to your insurance company. This is going to a provider who works at a qualified independent review entity, which we'll talk about on the next slide, some of the requirements that Kentucky has for the doctors making these decisions, because they might be helpful to us. But basically, this will be binding on both parties. It's the final appeal stage for private insurance. And while the external appeal does not always succeed, particularly for medical necessity denials, it's much more likely to succeed than the internal appeal process, which I think is clear when you think about the internal appeal going back to the insurance company that denied your care to begin with, but you have to get through that to get to the next stage. So in this external appeal process, you are not required to just submit the exact same information as the internal appeal. You can submit new information if you get it, if you get more provider support letters, if you find more information from different standards of care that support you getting your care covered, you can include all of that in this. And you just want to make sure that you do your best to gather all of the information you want included when you request this appeal, because once it's submitted to the review organization, they have a very set amount of time to review the claim. So you just want to make sure you have it all, because you might not have a chance to submit things later. And so you're just submitting all of your evidence of medical necessity, and then they are going to assess whether your insurance company made the right decision or not. So note, the people who review these appeals likely do not have experience in treating gender dysphoria. But we recently discovered that Kentucky does have a provision that requires IRE reviewers to have clinical experience in treating the condition being treated. Because of this, we recommend in your external appeal, including a request that the appeal be assigned to someone with experience treating gender dysphoria and referencing the statute. I have the statute listed there, but I'm also going to send it out in the email that I send you all with notes after this presentation. But specifically referencing that statute. Once again, want to note there that even when the case is assigned to someone with experience treating gender dysphoria, we know that providers who treat trans people still aren't always the best at treating trans people. Experience doesn't necessarily equal expertise in this scenario. So sometimes these decisions still might not follow WPATH standards of care. If an external appeal decision doesn't align with WPATH standards of care, you can request that the IRE re-review it. And in particularly egregious cases, there might be an option to challenge it in court. But unfortunately, usually this is the end of the road for the formal administrative appeals process for private insurance. Next, we're talking about the fair trial hearing. You must go through the internal appeals process first. Once again, this is only relevant for Medicaid. This is done within, oh, sorry, this is done. That's not correct. You have to submit a request in writing within 120 calendar days of your internal appeal denial. What you're going to include in your request is your name, address, and phone number, your reason for appealing, so why you think your insurance company made the wrong decision, your provider's name, the date of service and the type of service that was denied, and all of that evidence you wanted reviewed. So all of the evidence you had in that internal appeal stage and any other information that you've gathered that explains why you needed this item or service. And I don't know if I said this at the beginning, but you have to submit this in writing. You cannot email them. There's not, unfortunately, an online form. You need to submit this in writing to our state Department of Health and Family Services. We have, unfortunately, have folks not being granted this step in the process for really extended periods of time, unfortunately, which is not legal. But, you know, Kentucky doesn't always follow its own laws. So if this is the case for you, contact us and we will help you start the grievance process. Ideally, if things start working as they should and you get a fair trial hearing date, that's going to be scheduled. You can attend the hearing in person or request to have that hearing by phone. And you can have, you'll be present, obviously, and you can have a representative present if you'd like. This could be a friend, a lawyer, a family member, an advocate of some type, anyone you want to take with you to help make your case. There will be a representative from your managed care organization. And then there will be a hearing officer from the Kentucky Department for Health and Family Services, and that is going to be the person who is making the decision. And at this hearing, you're just going to tell the state why you disagree with the decision. You're going to take all of your medical necessity evidence that you've gathered throughout this process and, you know, make your case, basically. Once again, important to note, unfortunately, this process won't be particularly helpful if the denial is based on an explicit exclusion. But if you're getting a medical necessity denial or a denial based on sex-specific services, that's where this process will be helpful for you. Civil rights complaint. So regardless if you have Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance, managed by or subject to state law, not subject to state law, regardless, you can submit, if you are being denied care, you can submit a civil rights complaint to Health and Human Services. Particularly if your care was denied due to a blanket exclusion on transition-related care, or you were mistreated or misgendered in your communications with your insurance company, you can file a complaint both with your insurance company's civil rights coordinator, which might not be as effective, but can be helpful to just have that evidence that you did, you know, submit a civil rights complaint there, and with the Civil Rights Division of Health and Human Services. Just a note there that this is not a substitute for the appeals process, but there is a chance that you could achieve a case-by-case resolution with your insurance company. And it's additionally important that Health and Human Services sees the number of people being harmed by these discriminatory policies and can utilize these cases to enforce their administrative oversight regarding healthcare-related civil rights provisions like Section 1557 of the ACA. Originally, I have the link there because I originally planned to click and like walk you all through some of the process to show that it's not super intimidating. But since we're having so many technical issues, I will not be doing that because I don't want to navigate off my page and never get it back again. Some action items. So here are some ways that you can kind of, you can take action to support protections for gender-affirming care for trans folks, both locally and nationwide. The first is to join the Protect Trans Health campaign to help solidify civil rights protections for trans folks and new rules regarding Section 1557 of the ACA. So I'm going to be sending out these links and these action items in an email after we're done tonight. So you don't have to worry about writing those down if you don't have something handy. But basically what we want people to do is just submit a comment to Health and Human Services. It can be as simple as saying, I believe trans people deserve equal access to healthcare. Or if you have if you're a trans person who's had particularly egregious instances of discrimination in accessing healthcare, you can share your story. And having those long comments is especially helpful because people do actually go through and read them. And that's how they make determinations about those kind of final fine-tuned administrative rules that really have a major impact on healthcare for trans people. So be sure to check out the Protect Trans Health campaign. They're accepting comments, I believe, through October 4th, but I will clarify that and include that in the email as well. If you've attempted to get coverage for gender-affirming surgery under Kentucky Medicaid, I'm going to send out this Google form that you can fill out, which will help us gather more information about like why people are getting denials, how many people are getting denied, what type of access to the appeals process people are being given. And this will help us get more info so that we can do some administrative and legal advocacy to hopefully get the blanket exclusion that our MCOs have on gender-affirming care removed. Once again, if you need help with the appeals process, or in general, you need help accessing gender-affirming care, you need maybe a recommendation for a provider in your area, maybe you need advice for how to advocate for a different method of HRT that you want to pursue, you can always email us and we are happy to, me or one of our advocacy volunteers are happy to assist you. And last but not least, I'll send out a link for you to sign up for our email list. That's where we send out information about events that we're having. We have educational or community events just about every month. During the legislative session, we'll also be sending out alerts, especially if you decide to include your phone number in that. We send out text message alerts when there are new laws coming forward in committee meetings or being heard in the Senate or the House, so that you can make sure that your representatives know how you feel about trans people, that you don't want laws that will fuck us over and that you want the laws that are going to protect us. And with that, I can I'm going to end our recording so that if anyone has questions, you don't have to worry about your recording going out to people.